So there are some disadvantages to crowns, but otherwise they're quite important things.
Camilla will be known as Queen Consort as she continues her own loyal service.
The British royal family has kept many secrets over the centuries. Wars, affairs, scandals. The palace walls have absorbed them all without a whisper. But there is one secret that has been quietly simmering behind those walls for the past 3 years, and it involves a young woman most people still cannot name. She is not William. She is not Harry. She is not even Camilla. She is a 22-year-old who once spent her summers working at a garden center, a girl who used to sit beside her grandmother watching children's television, a young woman who learned to drive horse-drawn carriages through the fields of Windsor Great Park, guided by the steady hands of Prince Philip himself. And according to sources close to the palace, Queen Elizabeth II, in the final months of her life, made a series of deeply personal, deeply deliberate decisions about her estate. Decisions that quietly elevated this young woman above almost everyone else in the family. Decisions that left one very powerful woman absolutely seething. Camilla's family is furious, and the reason why tells you everything about how the late queen really felt about the people surrounding her throne. Stay with me, because this story is layered, it is dramatic, and it is far from over. Who is Lady Louise Windsor? Before we get into the inheritance, before we talk about what was left, to whom, and why it caused such an explosive reaction, you need to understand the woman at the center of all of this. Because if you have never heard of Lady Louise Windsor, that is entirely by design. Lady Louise, Alice Elizabeth Mary Mountbatten Windsor, was born on November 8, 2003, and her entry into this world was nothing short of terrifying. Her mother, Sophie, Countess of Wessex, suffered a sudden and severe placental abruption. It was an emergency. Doctors rushed Sophie to Frimley Park Hospital. Her father, Prince Edward, was thousands of miles away in Mauritius and did not make it in time. Louise was delivered by emergency cesarean section. Both mother and baby suffered serious blood loss. The tiny premature infant was transferred to the neonatal unit at St. George's Hospital in London, where she spent her earliest days fighting to survive. Now pause here for a moment. Think about what Queen Elizabeth was watching unfold. Her youngest son's wife, nearly dying. Her granddaughter, fragile, small, fighting, in an incubator far from home. Do you think a woman like Queen Elizabeth, who had weathered every storm the 20th century could throw at a monarch, simply moved on from that? Do you think she did not carry the weight of those early days every time she looked at Louise? She did not. And that protective love would quietly shape the next 2 decades. Louise also faced additional challenges in her early years. She was born with esotropia, a condition causing her eyes to misalign, and underwent multiple corrective surgeries as a child. Through all of it, her grandmother was watching, worrying, and growing closer. A palace insider revealed in 2019 that Queen Elizabeth genuinely favored Louise among her grandchildren. The insider described the Queen enjoying long stretches of time with Louise at Balmoral, forming a bond that was remarkably tender, especially considering the Queen's famous emotional reserve. Notably, Louise was even favored over the older, more high-profile grandchildren like William and Harry. Think about what that means. William is the future King of England. Harry was, for years, the most beloved royal in the public eye. And yet, according to those inside the palace, it was this quiet, unassuming girl who captured Elizabeth's heart most completely. Why? Because Louise never wanted anything from her grandmother except her grandmother. When Louise was a little girl, she came home one day confused. She asked her mother, Sophie, "Mommy, people keep telling me that Grandma is the queen." Sophie asked her how that made her feel, and Louise replied simply, "I don't understand." She did not understand, because to Louise, the woman sitting beside her watching Mr. Tumble on television was just Grandma, not a monarch, not an institution, just the woman who loved her. And to Queen Elizabeth, surrounded her entire life by people who wanted titles, wealth, status, and proximity to power. That simplicity was priceless. Prince Philip's final gift. On April 9, 2021, Prince Philip passed away at Windsor Castle at the age of 99. His funeral was one of the most watched events in recent royal history, and amid all the pomp and the solemnity, there was a moment that stopped people in their tracks. Two fell ponies, Balmoral Nevis and Knotlaw Storm, stood at the entrance to Windsor Castle beside a dark green carriage. On the seat of that carriage, Philip's driving cap, his leather gloves, his whip, and a small red tub of sugar lumps for his ponies. These were not ceremonial props. These were the private possessions of a man who had spent 50 years pouring his passion into the sport of carriage driving. Philip had taken up competitive carriage driving in 1971, after arthritis ended his polo career. He represented Great Britain in 6 World Championships and 3 European Championships. He was still competing well into his 80s. This was not a hobby, it was a calling, and he chose to pass that calling to Lady Louise. Philip personally taught Louise to drive a carriage during her teenage years. The two of them spent hour after hour together in Windsor Great Park, moving through the trees and the open fields, Philip coaching and guiding and watching his granddaughter grow into something remarkable. In 2019, he sat in the stands at the Royal Windsor Horse Show and watched Louise compete in the private driving singles. She placed third. His pride, by all accounts, was undisguised. When Philip died, he left Louise the carriages, the ponies, and the entire legacy of the sport he loved. Now ask yourself, when a man who represented his country at the highest levels of his sport, who competed for decades, who tied his entire post-polo identity to this passion, when that man decides who inherits all of it, who does he choose? He chose Louise, not because she was convenient, not because it was expected, because he saw in her the same fire he had in himself, and she honored that gift. In 2022, just months after Elizabeth's own death, Louise drove one of Philip's carriages in a parade at the Royal Windsor Horse Show. Queen Elizabeth, watching from the stands, reportedly had tears in her eyes. By 2024, Louise was competing at the British National Carriage Driving Championships, placing second in her class, competing under the royal surname Mountbatten Windsor, making clear she was not just inheriting Philip's possessions, but his competitive spirit. This was the first inheritance, and it set the stage for everything that followed. The Queen's private fortune. Here is where most people get confused, and the confusion matters because it shapes the entire inheritance story. When you think of Queen Elizabeth's wealth, you probably imagine Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, the crown jewels, the vast estates stretching across Britain. You think of a woman sitting atop roughly $28 billion in royal real estate, but almost none of that was actually hers. The Crown Estate, which includes Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Kensington Palace, and thousands of acres of land, is managed by a public board. It belongs to the monarchy as an institution, not to the individual who wears the crown. When Elizabeth died, it did not go through her will. It passed automatically to King Charles, just as it would have passed to any successor. Elizabeth's personal fortune was something different entirely. Estimated at approximately £500 million at the time of her death, her private estate included Balmoral Castle in Scotland, valued at around £80 million, and the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, worth approximately £250 million. Both properties were privately purchased by the royal family generations ago and belonged solely to her. Beyond real estate, Elizabeth's personal belongings included over 300 pieces of fine jewelry that were specifically hers, not the crown's, a private collection of racehorses, a personal car collection, and investment portfolios that, adjusted for growth, could have exceeded £100 million. Under a 1993 agreement with the British government, transfers of wealth between monarchs are exempt from the standard 40% inheritance tax. This meant that when Elizabeth's personal wealth passed to King Charles, it did so in full. But, and here is the critical point, Elizabeth could choose what happened to specific items, specific properties, and specific portions of her estate before she died. She could make gifts. She could rewrite portions of her will. She could look at everything she had built over 96 years and decide with total sovereignty who deserved what. And in the final months of her life, sources suggest she did exactly that. A source told Radar Online in July 2022, just 2 months before Elizabeth's death, that she had been carefully reviewing her most prized possessions, determining who among her heirs truly deserved each one. The whispers that followed were extraordinary. Last-minute changes, decisions that would shock some of her heirs and devastate others. Decisions that set one corner of the palace ablaze with anger. The jewelry war. Nothing triggered the inheritance fury more than Queen Elizabeth's jewelry. Elizabeth owned over 300 pieces of fine personal jewelry, not the crown jewels. Those belonged to the institution and now sit in the Tower of London for the next monarch. Her personal collection, pieces she had accumulated, loved and worn throughout her reign. Reports indicate that Queen Elizabeth chose to leave approximately £110 million worth of that personal jewelry collection to Catherine, Princess of Wales. £110 million to Kate, not to Camilla. Let that settle for a moment. Camilla Parker Bowles had spent decades navigating one of the most turbulent paths in modern royal history. She had endured public vilification, the shadow of Diana's memory, and years of being treated as the monarchy's most controversial figure. She had waited, she had worked. She had, by the time of Elizabeth's death, earned the title of Queen Consort. And the Queen left her personal jewelry, her most intimate, meaningful possessions, not to the woman who was about to become queen alongside her son, but to her grandson's wife. An insider told Radar Online at the time, "Kate is clearly the family favorite. She would never say it, but it is one reason Camilla resents Kate." Think about what this says. Not just about the jewelry, about intent, about Elizabeth's private assessment of the people around her. Elizabeth was not making random choices in those final months. She was making statements. She was, through the language of inheritance, telling the world, or at least the small world of the House of Windsor, exactly how she felt about each person in her life. And the statement she made about Camilla was loud in its silence. Camilla's net worth is estimated at around $5 million, a fraction of the wealth circulating through the royal family. She has access to enormous resources through Charles, of course. But in terms of personal inheritance from Queen Elizabeth, almost nothing. Meanwhile, Kate received a treasure. Louise received the most emotionally significant possessions of Prince Philip. And Camilla's family, her children from her first marriage, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, watched all of it happen from the outside. Can you imagine how that felt? Camilla's family and the royal circle. Tom Parker Bowles is Camilla's son from her first marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles. He is a food critic, author, and, since his mother became Queen Consort, a more frequent presence at Buckingham Palace events. Laura Lopes, Camilla's daughter, has similarly been drawn into royal circles since her mother's elevation. But there is a fundamental problem, and it is a problem that no amount of palace access can solve. Tom and Laura are not of royal blood. They carry no royal title. They are, in the formal architecture of the British monarchy, stepchildren of the king, present in the family, but not of the family in the hereditary sense that matters for succession and inheritance. Lady Louise Windsor, by contrast, is the granddaughter of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. She is 17th in line to the throne. She carries the Mountbatten Windsor name. She is, in every formal and informal sense, a direct product of the royal line that has defined Britain for generations. Some European media outlets have suggested that Tom Parker Bowles could benefit from King Charles's future will, particularly given Camilla's influence over her husband. That is possible. Charles's will is his own, and Camilla is his queen. Her voice carries weight, but what Charles chooses to do with his estate is entirely separate from what Elizabeth chose to do with hers. And Elizabeth's choices, her deeply personal, carefully considered choices, did not favor Camilla's family in any significant way. Camilla sees this, Tom sees this, and the resentment, according to royal insiders, has been building steadily. It is worth asking, is Camilla's frustration about the inheritance itself or about what the inheritance reveals? Because what it reveals is this: Queen Elizabeth, even in her final days, did not fully embrace Camilla as family. Not the way she embraced Kate. Not the way she embraced Louise. That is the wound that no jewelry or property can heal. Why Edward and Sophie's family was quietly elevated. To fully understand Louise's position in the inheritance story, you need to understand her parents and why Queen Elizabeth favored their branch of the family so quietly and so consistently. Prince Edward is Elizabeth's youngest child, and in a family that generated more headlines than most soap operas, Edward gave his mother the one gift she craved above all others: peace. While Charles's love life dominated tabloid covers for decades, while Andrew's scandal shook the foundations of the monarchy, while Anne carved out her fiercely independent path, Edward simply built a life. He married Sophie Rhys-Jones in 1999. He raised his children away from cameras. He showed up for royal duties without complaint and without drama. Sophie, his wife, became what many insiders describe as the Queen's favorite daughter-in-law. After leaving her PR career in 2002, she threw herself into royal service, eventually supporting over 70 charities. She was discreet, warm, reliable, and above all, loyal. Not performatively loyal, genuinely loyal. The Queen appreciated this more than most people realize. When King Charles bestowed the title of Duke of Edinburgh on Edward in 2023, it was widely read as a sign of reward, a confirmation that Edward and Sophie had earned something the rest of the family had not: the monarchy's trust, and their children reflected their values. Louise worked at a garden center. She went to university. She trained in the Army Reserve. She lived, in other words, like a normal person, not a princess. Her mother Sophie said publicly that both Louise and her brother James would very likely need to work for a living rather than rely on royal privilege. In a family where entitlement has caused incalculable damage, that attitude was revolutionary. Elizabeth saw it. She rewarded it, and the family members who expected different, who felt they deserved more purely by proximity to power, are still processing the sting. Lady Louise's quiet rise. Here is what makes Lady Louise truly remarkable. She built herself up while no one was watching. While William and Harry were being photographed everywhere, Louise was studying. She attended St. George's School at Windsor Castle, and then St. Mary's School, Ascot, for her A-levels, where she chose to study English, history, politics, and drama. That combination is not an accident. It is the toolkit of someone thinking seriously about public life. In September 2022, just days after her grandmother's death, Louise began studying English at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, the same university where Prince William met Kate Middleton 2 decades earlier. Royal watchers noted the significance immediately. But Louise was not done building her identity. In 2024, she joined the Tayforth University Officer Training Corps, a British Army Reserve unit. Photos emerged of her in military gear, face paint, helmet marked with Windsor, training alongside her peers. By 2025, she had become an officer cadet in the Army Reserve. Consider what this trajectory looks like. Carriage driving champion in the tradition of Prince Philip, English student at the university that shaped the future king, Army officer cadet echoing Queen Elizabeth's own early service during World War II. At 16, Elizabeth began her first official wartime duty inspecting troops. At 18, she joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, becoming the first female royal to serve actively in the armed forces. Louise is following a strikingly similar path. Royal commentator Richard Fitzwilliams noted publicly that Louise has traits from both grandparents. She carries Elizabeth's shyness and her disciplined sense of duty. She carries Philip's competitive fire and his love of physical challenge. There are currently only 4 working royals under the age of 70. The monarchy's future depends on young members willing to serve. And with Harry gone, and the institution under constant scrutiny, the need for trustworthy, hard-working royals has never been greater. Louise has not announced herself. She has not sought cameras or headlines. She has simply prepared. And sometimes, that is the most powerful move of all. The inheritance battle behind closed doors. Let us now return to Camilla, because while the public story is about jewelry and carriages, the private story is about something much bigger. When Queen Elizabeth passed in September 2022, the inheritance battles that followed were not just about who received what. They were about what each gift said about the late Queen's loyalties, and they were about what comes next, because Charles's will, still unwritten in its final form, is the next frontier. Sources have reported that Camilla is actively involved in shaping King Charles's estate planning. Her focus, insiders suggest, is twofold. First, she wants to ensure that Prince Harry's share of whatever Charles leaves is diminished, a reflection of the royal family's ongoing estrangement from the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Second, she wants her own son, Tom Parker Bowles, to benefit from Charles's generosity in a way that compensates for what he did not receive from Elizabeth. This is where it becomes complicated, because the royals Louise stands to benefit from are her direct grandparents. Her claim on their legacies, emotional, symbolic, and material, is unassailable. Tom Parker Bowles cannot compete with that. Not legally, not morally, not in terms of royal tradition. Camilla knows this, and that knowledge, according to those close to the palace, is a source of profound frustration. Simply showed up, year after year, as herself. And Queen Elizabeth, with the sharp perception of a woman who had spent 70 years reading people, saw exactly who Louise was and loved her for it. The inheritance was not a transaction. It was a recognition, and that is exactly what makes it so impossible for Camilla to argue against. The title she refused. Here is something that most people do not know, and it reveals everything about Louise's character. When Louise turned 18, she became eligible to use the title Her Royal Highness. As the daughter of a prince, the title was hers to claim. Many in her position would have taken it without hesitation. Louise chose not to. She decided to remain plain Lady Louise Windsor, no HRH, no princess title, no formal royal designation beyond what she was born with. In a family where titles are fought over, where proximity to the throne is measured and competed for, where Camilla spent years maneuvering toward the title of queen, Louise walked in the opposite direction. And here is the paradox. By refusing to chase status, she gained something more durable than status. She gained credibility. She gained the respect of people inside and outside the palace. She demonstrated, in the most concrete way possible, that she was not in this for what she could get. Think about how that must have looked to Queen Elizabeth. Here was a young woman who could have used the full machinery of the royal title and chose not to, while certain other members of the family were busy demanding deference and expanding their public profiles. Louise was working at a garden center and getting on with her life. Royal observers have noted that in the British monarchy, those who do not reach for power often end up receiving the most of it. It is a counterintuitive truth, but it holds. The crown tends to trust humility, and Elizabeth, who spent her entire reign serving rather than seeking, understood that truth better than anyone. Louise's decision to decline the HRH was not just gracious, it was strategic in the deepest sense, not because she calculated it that way, but because it was genuinely who she was, and authentic humility, in that world, is rarer than any jewel in Elizabeth's collection. What happens next? Here is the truth that the palace does not want widely discussed. The inheritance of Queen Elizabeth's estate is not fully settled. It may not be for years. Wills of this magnitude, involving properties, collections, investment portfolios, and items of extraordinary historical significance, are complex. The details of what Louise has received, what remains in trust, and what may pass to her in the future are not entirely public. What we do know is this. Queen Elizabeth made deliberate choices. She chose Kate over Camilla. She supported Philip's decision to give Louise his carriages, his ponies, and his legacy. She spent her final years in quiet conversation with Louise, watching her granddaughter grow into someone she was visibly proud of. We also know that King Charles's will, whenever it is finalized, will be another chapter in this story. Camilla's influence over Charles is real. Tom Parker Bowles's proximity to the palace has grown. The battle over what the royal family's wealth says about the royal family's values is ongoing. And Lady Louise is still only 22 years old. She is at university. She is training as an army officer. She is competing in national carriage driving championships. She is, in every measurable way, becoming more, not less. Royal commentator Richard Fitzwilliams has made the point clearly. There are very few working royals under 70. The institution needs people willing to serve, and the pattern Louise has established, quiet, committed, deeply connected to both of her grandparents' legacies, makes her an extraordinarily valuable asset to the monarchy's future. Camilla can be furious. Tom Parker Bowles can watch from the sidelines. The tabloids can speculate. But Louise is building something that cannot be taken away by any will, any title dispute, or any palace politics, a genuine legacy of her own. What this tells us about Queen Elizabeth. Let us step back for a moment and look at the full picture. Queen Elizabeth II reigned for 70 years. She outlasted 15 prime ministers. She navigated world wars, constitutional crises, and the most turbulent chapters of modern British history. She was, by any measure, one of the most consequential figures of the 20th and 21st centuries. And in her final months, when she turned her attention to her estate, to the question of what she would leave behind, and to whom, she made choices that were unmistakably personal. She chose Kate, the woman who would one day be queen, and gave her a treasure worth £110 million. She supported Philip's choice of Louise and honored the bond they had built together. She spent quiet hours with Louise and James, watching children's television, sharing the kind of ordinary warmth that the palace rarely permits. She did not leave her most intimate gifts to the people with the most power. She left them to the people she loved most, and perhaps that is the most human thing about her. Beneath the crown, beneath the centuries of protocol and tradition and duty, there was a grandmother who had favorites, who remembered which granddaughter helped Princess Charlotte draw rabbits, who sat in the stands at the Royal Windsor Horse Show with tears running down her face as Louise drove Philip's carriage one final time. Queen Elizabeth could not speak freely in life about who she loved most. The monarchy does not permit that kind of candor, but in death, through the quiet architecture of her estate and her gifts, she said everything. She said it with carriages. She said it with jewelry. She said it with the choice of who sat beside her in those final private years. And she said it loudly enough that Camilla's family heard it perfectly. So here is the question I want to leave you with. In a family defined by hierarchy, by blood, by centuries of inherited power, what actually earns loyalty? What makes a queen, or a king, or an elderly grandmother deciding the fate of her estate choose one person over another? Is it title? Camilla has a title. She is Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. Is it proximity? Tom Parker Bowles is at palace events regularly. He is present. Or is it something simpler? Something that a garden center job and a tearful horse show and a lifetime of showing up as yourself quietly demonstrates. Lady Louise Windsor never sought any of this. She never asked for the carriages, the love, or the inheritance. She simply was who she was, consistently, authentically, and without agenda. And one of the greatest monarchs in modern history looked at her and said, "This one. This is the one I trust." That is the story of Lady Louise Windsor. And something tells me we are only in the early chapters. If this story surprised you, if there is a part of the royal family you thought you understood and now see differently, drop a comment below. I want to know what stood out to you most. Was it the jewelry decision? The carriage inheritance? Louise's choice to refuse her royal title? Or something else entirely? And if you want to go deeper on the royal family's inheritance battles, the stories the palace never volunteers, make sure you are subscribed. Because this particular story, it is far from over.